Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Liz, and I want to wish you a very warm welcome to this, our second Future of Cities Summit. I am here in the newsroom at Tortoise in London, and we are partnering today with our friends over in Canada at the Globe and Mail. So hello to everybody who is watching from Vancouver or Calgary or wherever you may be. It's a real pleasure to be hosting the first thinking of a run of 5 across the course of this afternoon. For those of you that haven't been to a Tortoise thinking before, the idea is it's not just us, myself and our invited experts who are going to be talking over the next 45 minutes, but we want to hear from you as well. The chat is open throughout the whole of the session, and we would love for you to pile in with questions, thoughts, remarks, comments, builds, challenges about the things that you're hearing on screen. What we're trying to do, of course, is have an interesting and thought-provoking conversation about the future of cities for its own sake. But we're also trying to do more than that. We are a newsroom, of course, the Globe and Mail is too. And what we're looking for here are stories. We're looking for the kernels of ideas that can give us ways that we can report on cities, urban design, the way people live in cities, how that might affect the economics of urban life, things like this, that we can bring and build into our journalism. So my colleague Steph is in the, sorry, excuse me, I always call her Steph. This is so embarrassing. I said before I come downstairs, it's not Steph, it's Sophie. She'll be laughing. Sophie Fenton is moderating the chat. So please do join in with her. And if you have useful links, web links, reports and stuff like that, when we do a summit, we're always super interested to know of other further reading material that we can get stuck into. So the first session right now, if our overall theme for the day is what are cities for, then what we're going to talk about now is who are cities for, because there's a really fascinating set of data points that before we started preparing for today, I really wasn't aware of. And I'm going to come to my first invited expert, Natalie Turner, to sort of talk us through some of the statistical, surprising perhaps, population flavor, demographic stuff about the types of people who are living in and around urban environments. Natalie, you're head of Localities Centre for Ageing Better, so perhaps the clue a little bit is in your job title, but could you just sort of get us off to a good start with explaining what is the shape in terms of demographics of who lives in cities now from an age perspective?
Yeah, I think, well, cities are kind of experiencing exactly the kind of same demographic change we're experiencing globally and across the whole country, although it's showing up in slightly different ways. And I think the thing is that it's worth pointing out that it's different in different countries as well. So some of the flavour for today is going to come from more of a UK perspective, and actually demographic ageing and how cities are growing and the speed at which they're ageing globally compared to the UK, and having to plan cities is very different. So I think that might come up later, but today I'm having a bit of a focus on the UK. Essentially, and this is exactly the same thing that's happening in cities as everywhere. If you were born 100 years ago, a baby born 100 years ago, you could be expected to live to about 58. But if you were born today, you could expect to see your 90th birthday. Now that's that's 30 years of extra life, right? And essentially, and this is the bit that people kind of, for me, miss in this sort of intergenerational conflict debate really, is that is essentially about young people getting to grow old. And so population aging is driven by more of us surviving into and living longer and surviving into later life, quite frankly. And I think that people don't often think about it that way, because that's actually the same thing that's driving population growth. It's not, the number of children in the world is about steady for the whole of this century, about 2 billion globally. But the population growth, which will go from 8 billion to 11 billion, is driven by older adults. That is us not dying young. So I think we need to kind of go, that's a celebration. And that just kind of makes a mockery of, I think, a lot of that time of thinking about young versus old. And the other point I kind of wanted to make, which is, I know you've got some great stats up there around urbanization, around the tipping point, more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 5. I think that was in 2010, that kind of tipping point happened, or 2019, actually, that tipping happened. In 2010, the majority of us, the tipping point happened as more of us living in cities than ever in human history. And I think the thing is that is about more people, or more of us than ever in human history, growing older in cities, as well as more of us being older. We don't just arrive in later life living in a city, we grow older in them. And if you think about that population growth that's happening exactly in cities, the growth, say in Greater Manchester, I know that came up earlier on, the biggest growth in population is coming from older age groups, and particularly the 85%, 85 and older, which is expected to triple over the next 20, 30 years, that older age group. So I think the thing is that I make the distinction between growing older and being older, because cities have two roles, right? They have two roles. They have a huge impact on how well we age, and so therefore what kind of older people we're going to be in the future, whether we're going to be healthy, wealthy, socially connected, etc. But also to be supported, and I know my colleagues are going to talk a little bit more about that, to be supported if and when our abilities fail. And the reason I say if and when our abilities fail is that there are huge inequalities in cities in the experience of aging. So we talk about, there's about 9 years nationally and within cities in life expectancy difference. It's about 17 years in healthy life expectancy. So if you were in Newham, in London, a borough in London, you could expect as a woman to get to 57 before you have a life-limiting condition of some sort. And if you were a man in Richmond upon Thames, you could expect to live to 74, 75 before you have any impact on your health. Now, if you think about what it is to be a woman living in Newham, a very diverse, already much more deprived community in London, your experience of work, family, transport, and everything is going to be just more brutal than if you've got a nice retirement in Richmond upon Thames. And I know men who live in Richmond upon Thames, and I know it's a nice retirement. So you might not get to retire, is kind of the point I'm saying. And so that has huge implications, and I won't go into too much detail around that, but that has huge implications, city economies, for keeping our workforce. You know, city economies drive country economies. People need to be earning, spending, you know, thriving financially in cities, paying taxes. High streets need to have a better offer. Culture needs to have a better offer for older people. We need to think about that. We need to think about transport, which on the whole is set up to get people in and out of work and commuting. If you're talking about commuters that are older, if you think the pension age is pushing back to 60, 68, 69, it's going to be, you know, there's a big gap between you having a health condition maybe at 57 and work, and you having to get on a bus in a city and go into town and back, so it needs to be more accessible. And then if you think about homes and communities as well, how your home stays accessible and adaptable as you age is going to be critical. And more of us than ever before are renting. And 50s and 60s, I think it's doubled the amount of private sector renter for people in the 50s and 60s now compared to a generation before. And that's only going to increase. So those are the sorts of things I just wanted to, I'm conscious that other people want to get in on this conversation.
I was listening intently because you were sort of opening lots and lots of cans of things that we could have a go at there, Natalie. So thank you for that. I might come to Soma next, if I may. Soma Pasarathi, you are the urban design leader at Arup, and some of the things that Natalie was describing, I just wonder if you can help me get my bearings a little bit, because I'm not sure if the way that I should come at this question, who are cities for, and how a city that is specifically designed for older people and people who are getting older, to acknowledge the distinction that Natalie made. I don't know what the sort of particular characteristics would be of that city relative to some of the ones we've already got. And I just want to sort of acknowledge what Emma J has been saying in the chat, which is, let's not forget, we're not only talking about, you know, London, Manchester, Glasgow, Vancouver, Montreal, we're talking about Hereford, Worcester, you know, smaller places too. These all count as cities. So what would be the characteristics of a really particularly age-friendly city, for example? How different is it?
Well, there's a couple of ways to look at it. I think one thing I would say at the start is cities have to be fully inclusive. They have to be for everyone. And, so in some ways, looking at cities for older people, cities for children, there's lots of research around all of that is just one way of saying that we have to design cities for everyone. So that's a bit of a starting point. And one might be forgiven for if you look at how we discuss new developments in cities, or regeneration of cities and towns and smaller towns, they seem to be evolving into places that support sort of a pacey urban lifestyle centered around economic growth and retail, employment, enterprise activity, perhaps inadvertently prioritizing a certain more active demographic.
Yeah.
And in recent time, there's been plenty of research around age-friendly cities, of course, but also lots of research on child-friendly cities. And it's quite interesting to see that both these groups have some quite similar challenges and vulnerabilities in cities. And it makes you think that a good city for one is a good city for the other, and in fact, a good city for everyone. But coming to older people, so, thinking, what is it that are some specific challenges that they face? Although we've started off by saying that, good inclusive cities work for everyone, they perhaps do have some specific challenges. And again, as Natalie said, I don't want to club all older people into a similar type of person, because some are more active, the 57-year-old in Newham versus the 75-year-old in Richmond. But I think maybe three things I would point out. One is, I do think that perhaps there's a sort of a little bit of a loss of everyday freedoms that some of us take into account. And this is about the ability to move around more easily, the ability to sort of pick up and plan and go get something, run an errand, and be fully sort of independent and confident about being out there and doing what you need. So it's a small thing, and most of us don't think about it, but I think that begins to erode a little bit. The second thing is the feeling of social isolation. And I do think you put up a slide at the start of this. And this partly because of perhaps the loss of everyday freedoms, but also as you go older, your family and friends begin to move away, and you do start feeling this sense of isolation. And it's much harder for older people to downsize in their own community. So sometimes if they have to move, they move elsewhere, and that little bit exacerbates that sense of isolation. So what do you begin to do about that? I think that's important. And the third thing I would say is just, again, a sort of a diminishing access to just little bits of city infrastructure, facilities and amenities, or everything from little things like benches or handrails or step-free routes to larger things like healthcare facilities. I mean, are they too far away? Can they be a little bit more integrated? So I think there's a whole range of things that are somewhat specific for aging populations. And so what can we as city planners and urban designers really do about it? I mean, there's a number of things, and there's some wonderful examples across the world, little policy, but also little projects that people have done. But I would, again, pick up three things. One is, I do think we need to, in all ways, improve accessibility to public transport for aging population. This includes everything from accessible design of stations, building more housing that are attractive to older people near transport links, making sure that routes to transport are walkable and safe and all this. I think just making sure that there's more access and accessibility around public transport is really important, I think. The second thing is to introduce more intergenerational things in cities, be they intergenerational homes. I mean, a lot of developments are now looking at that, so that older people can live with their families, perhaps, and intergenerational spaces and places, not just the skate park and the children's playground, but what are these places where, people of all ages like to hang out? And perhaps some intergenerational programs. I mean, there's a wonderful example in Japan where they have there's a municipality that has a program on intergenerational gardening. So older people teach younger people how to garden in allotments. I mean, what a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
And the third thing I would say is, just coming back to health facilities, just more integrated health facilities in our cities. It's really getting quite polarized. You have the big hospitals and home care and, what's in between. And just today, the Wolfson Economics Prize was announced. And the question was, what's the hospital design for the future? And the winner is a small 200-bed hospital called Living Systems, which the architect who won says needs to be much more integrated in the middle of our cities. There needs to be more hospitals, smaller, more hospitals with ground floors that have markets and other things that the community can begin to use. And they call it the third carer, along with the NHS, your friends and family, and this hospital. So I think there's a number of things which we can do consciously and through policy and through little catalysts that would really help. I think this issue.
Fascinating. Thanks so much, Samuel. I can see some great comments coming in the chat. I promise I will bring some people in to contribute in a second, but I can't wait any longer before going to Lisa Taylor, who is, I think you're a native Canadian, as well as being the Executive Director of Future of London. So you're ticking all the boxes today for us, Lisa, and thank you so much for being here. So much just mentioned at the end of what she was describing there, policy, we can be quite deliberate and purposeful about making cities a better place for everybody, but for the purposes of today, specifically for older people. What are the main policy levers you think at your disposal as a person, with influence in London particularly?
Well, I'm Coherent Cities as well as Future of London, so I'm global as well as local. And I think that the place I operate in is at the interstices between public, private, and third sector to a degree, which is where all of this needs to happen. So Future of London, I put a link in and I can share it again, did a great piece of work in 2017-18 on aging cities. Arup was a part of that big time, as were some house builders, developers, and architects thinking about how cities could function as buildings and spaces between the buildings for older people. In the research at that time, only 10% of local plans in England had any kind of consideration specifically for older people, but that was already starting to change. And when you got to London as a major city, who, I think where policymakers see people getting older around them and they see the health implications of that, that was climbing up. There were 90% of the borough councils within Greater London that had some kind of consideration for older people's policies in them, which is a great thing to see. The biggest thing, of course, housing is a massive determinant of health. It's kind of come up already, and it's a real pinch point, because one of the things that's appeared is you've got sort of care homes, which are often lower income necessarily. There's social care for people who are on benefit and so forth. And then there's very affluent care and housing for older people. In terms of simply market and asset class, there's not enough in the middle. There's not enough for someone like me. So I've just turned 55. I am a renter by choice. One of the things I think is important across anywhere, but certainly places where culturally renting is a tenure of last resort, that has got to change, because as people are getting older, also as older people are perhaps giving a bunch of their savings to their children or even their grandchildren to help them buy a house, they should be able to rent. My mother is somewhere in Europe. I don't know where she is. She's renting from house to house. I've lost her, but that's by choice. And I think one of the things in there too that ties to housing and health is, Natalie talked about living to 90. People should want to live to 90 and not go, oh my God, my quality of life is so poor. I don't want to be here anymore. That's tragic, and that has to be avoided. And that's partly about poverty, but also quality of life. In that same sort of housing vein too, rental should be a thing. That there's an issue of cost for housing. There's a lot of pressure because a colleague of mine, Claire Benny of Municipal, who's an architect by training, ran the numbers on quality older people's housing care. She said, basically, it doesn't stack up on market points. If you have adaptability and all the kinds of things that you need technically for older people who may need more care in a house, plus public realm, plus et cetera, it's really hard to make it stack up. So you need some intervention potentially from the state,
right?
And you need to bring people in who see older people as a valuable housing market. British Land has done that with a development in London called Canada Water, as it happens, and they have looked at that group as a group of people it's worth marketing to. So when, for instance, on the public sector side, they're saying we need housing delivery that includes flats for, say, younger people, career builders, etc. We must also have 2 and 3 bedroom because we have to accommodate for families that want to be in cities, and Emma J, cities of any size. I hear that very much. But also, what is the provision for older people? I'm in a building that is from the 30s. It's the building that Poirot takes place in, the Agatha Christie TV show.
Oh.
And we have a group. Yeah, we have a group called the Ancients who are in their 80s and 90s who've been here forever. There is another group that I'm at the bottom band of, that I've 50, 55 to about 70, in good health, maybe semi-retired, super, super communal. I think that's one thing that's really critical. They have been taking care of each other through COVID. And I think that's something that needs to be encouraged on a public, private, and voluntary level as well, is trying to make space for that communal support. COVID, in a way, one of the benefits was it highlighted the health dangers and vulnerability of older people, and also the isolation of older people. So hopefully that's feeding its way into policy over time. But the other thing in terms of quality of life that can be done somewhat through local government intervention, but sometimes it has to be a bit more broad, is issues where there are differences, where, say, a city for younger people could be a very noisy city. So are there places, I just put this in the comment, where there's sort of a boisterous area of the park and a area and a quiet area of the park? There are parks that are just meant for people who are sight impaired that just smell great, and you can touch the textures. So there has to be accommodation for stuff like that. And I think no matter what, there has to be more conversation between, again, those public and private sectors, thinking about what can we provide and how. And one of the things that's going to be coming to the fore in that public-private dialogue is the question of heritage protection. That's not just in London with all the ancient buildings, it's anywhere where there's older buildings or conservation areas that need to be protected. Now that climate change is forcing us to think about insulation and retrofit or refurbishment, that, I guess, sacrosanct nature of heritage is starting to diminish a bit. And if we start thinking about this booming population, Natalie said it, I think we said it in the pre-chat, at least 80% of the buildings that we are in this city are already built. Some of them are in bad shape, and there has got to be provision for those to be repaired and refurbished over time for older people to stay in place when it's safe to do so. So I think there's a lot of interplay between public and private sector in terms of public realm and the actual buildings. The cost thing is going to be a problem for a long time, though.
I'm pleased you mentioned the sort of heritage question. And Lisa, Natalie, Soma, or anybody watching, just try and help me understand this, because I'm here in the centre of London. There are people watching in cities and rural areas all over the place. And the thing about, I can't imagine how you would materially turn the tanker, so to speak, of a city. I mean, London is a big and old place. And to do the kind of adaptation that would be required to make even this square mile that I happen to be sitting in environmentally friendly, inclusive for everybody, to all the points that you've been saying, Lisa, to accommodate neurodiversity, people who are blind, people who are older and less mobile, whatever it might be, children. I can't imagine how that could ever be achieved at scale, even with the most willing public and private conversation. Super happening. I can't imagine where you even begin. Do we always end up in conversations like this, talking about, in theory, this is how it should happen, but having to content ourselves with some nice little pockets of cool schemes here and there?
It's got to be something that I think starts at, in a sense, the local level. But again, if it gets into policy at the local level and at central government level, or whatever, federal government, wherever you're in from, it has to be concerted above the piece. And it also, as I say, has to be the private sector that takes part. So the heritage piece, heritage and climate change were my dissertation for my master's. And interviewing someone from Arup, the answer was, we can't possibly make the targets, but there are technologies out there that will allow you to upgrade buildings without massive disruption. They're just really expensive right now. So there's a piece about, say, ESG, environmental social governance, investing to get behind technologies to make that kind of retrofit much more affordable to do. Like solar panels have come down in price, so there's a market influence there. There also, we've done something. So in my work with leadership programs, we've gone to one of the boroughs and had people who are sight impaired take council officers around, because they'll make placemaking things or plan them and end up producing things that don't work. So having someone take you around, older people, disabled people, etc., to show you what's going on makes a difference. So it's got to be sort of central, local, and hyper local, if you like.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I've seen Natalie and Soma both put their little yellow hands up. Should we go Natalie first and then Soma? Natalie, are you able to respond? Thank you. Go for it.
Yeah, just to pick up on some of Sonia's and Lisa's points, really. I think there's an awful lot where we could be looking for common ground on agendas. And I had two there that are really important. One's around the kind of carbon zero agenda in particular. Active travel, getting people out of their cars, walking. It's the over 50s that are the biggest car users in this country. It won't work, that getting people out of their cars, unless we involve and think about that older age group and how they can move around. Same with retrofitting. We're thinking about decarbonising our homes. There's also an opportunity there to think about how those homes can also be not just thermally better, but also adaptable or accessible. There's an opportunity there, but of course cost is an issue. Renting, that intergenerational pieces, there's a real, there's got to be better renting options. We've got to sort out the private sector renting sector in terms of affordability and being able to change those homes. Those are homeowners. And there's real common ground for young and old around that issue. So I think we should be getting together rather than seeing it as being one generation or another. And then the other thing around that, it would be very hard to change the cities that exist already. We have to think about that mix, because it will be just a few small units and allowing people to move within a community. We're doing some research with the University of Manchester to test this out with local authorities about how you can understand who lives there, what they might need, and what is the mix of housing you need, not just like turning around and making everything one kind of housing. There are plenty of people who live in Lisa's house for like the ancients and do quite well and good and great on them. But if they want to move, they need to be able to move.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And we'll go to Soma, and then I'm going to bring in a couple of people who've been watching in the chat. I'd love to speak to Lisa McTaggart and Annie McInnes as well, who's just made a comment in the chat. I'd love to speak to you. But Soma, you just wanted to follow up a little bit on this while we're at it, didn't you?
Yes. And Liz, I wanted to address your point. How can we do this, an inclusive city for everyone across the board, everywhere? And will we only have some cool little pockets here and there? And I don't think it has to be quite so polarized. I do think it will be practically impossible with the hit of a gong or change of policy to transform everything to be ideal. But I do think actually that having a good density of great places, whether it's homes, options, public spaces, all over the place, will slowly sort of build up into a fair degree of choice for different people to go to in their city. I mean, everything won't work for everyone all the time, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of wonderful little projects that begin to turn the tide a little bit and sort of join up to create a wonderful network of inclusive opportunities in cities, really. And last but not least, there's one thing to say, we should change the policy and we should provide this and we should do that. I think for older people, it's a little bit about attitude change as well. There are many cultures that really value what older people bring to society. So we're thinking, what are their needs and how do we fulfill it? But in some ways, older people, they bring experience, they bring wisdom, they have gravitas, they're treasure trove of stories, they have the gift of time. And in some ways, I think as designers, we need to think of, if we bring older people into some of these intergenerational spaces, they also bring something valuable for the rest of us. And if we kind of approach designing our cities from that perspective, I think it's much easier. It's not, fixing things for different demographics, but it's really joining people up as society should be.
Interesting. I do tend to sort of adopt the mode of accommodation rather than celebration and cherishing. I'd love to come to Lisa McTaggart, if you are there. I hope that you have now the power of yes. Hi, Lisa.
Good morning.
Good morning. Whereabouts are you in the world?
I am in Guelph, Ontario, Canada.
Well, it's lovely to speak to you. You've mentioned a couple of things in the chat. I was the one particularly that caught my eye was about the cost for retrofitting buildings to reduce energy demand dropping every day. I always worry that this still feels like a very expensive thing to do, to sort of adjust my home to be more energy efficient things. Just tell me how your experience of that.
Well, it's mostly a data set of one in terms of retrofitting our 1970s build large suburban ranchy type house that's actually in the middle of an urban area, but it wasn't when it was first built. And I was actually quite surprised as we began a project to reduce the carbon footprint of this dwelling that's heated with natural gas and has an extremely large exterior envelope, at how it was actually possible. We hired an engineering company, and they actually came back to us with a plan to get to net zero for our big house. And it was actually surprisingly affordable. No, it wasn't cheap, and we couldn't implement the plan all at once, but we've been slowly chipping away at the tasks, and it's rather not noticeable in terms of what we've been able to do. And I think that the costs to do it, when you balance it against the savings, now the barrier, I think, is that there has to be a way to finance this, because the savings costs are in the future, and you have a large capital expansion at the beginning. So there has to be some kind of a mechanism to make it so people who want to do it can do it. And our community is actually looking at mechanisms such as having an investment fund for people who would like to invest money in green energy projects, to be able to finance sort of a bond that would be tied to, say, a property tax levy kind of mechanism.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Lovely to hear from you, and lovely to hear us. Well, I suppose it's our second Canadian voice, because we've heard Lisa's voice already. Let's hear from Annie McInnes. I think I'm quite like to hear a couple of sort of practical project examples, and I can see that Lisa and Sonia have been talking about one in Barnet that's brilliant. But Annie, you've got a specific example of a housing scheme or project near you.
Yes, hello from Calgary, Alberta. And apologies, I did not expect to be on camera. I thought I was just watching all of this. I'm still in my pajamas.
Absolutely excellent. That's how we like it, Annie.
Yes, I'm executive director of a business improvement area, not-for-profit here in Calgary. And we have an interesting not-for-profit that also operates here called Norfolk Housing. They own one large building, multi-story building in my business improvement area, but they also own about 6 more smaller buildings within the vicinity. And that they mix market value apartments with professional people who have income and can afford to live on the high street, with subsidized housing for people with health issues or life challenges. Okay. And they have a communal space on the main floor with a food pantry and supports and sharing things for example, elderly people with children visiting. There are puzzles and games and books and things on the main level that you can borrow at any time, and access to food for those who need that, and lots of public space outside that is accommodating. And they do a great job in all of their buildings of mixing those market value people with income to spare, and those people with life or financial challenges who do not.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. What a lovely example, and nice to see you. And if you're in your pajamas, that is absolutely fine. Lisa, you put your hand up just when Annie was speaking there as well.
I love some jammies. I love some jammies. It's all good in a session. I've been writing furiously in the chat, sort of answering questions. I didn't know if I'd come back on or not. there is a real life example that I think is worth mentioning, because I'm from Quebec, and I have a friend there who's a bit older than me. She is now looking for land kind of on our behalf, me about 5-10 years from now, so that we can have some sort of cooperative thing. The scheme that I mentioned in Barnet in London took 14 years, thinking of the policy piece, to convince council officers to help provide land for this, at that point, fairly untried model of sort of co-living for older people. Like, oh, I can't take care of themselves, what's going to go on? I mean, this is for people with their own money. That's why it's so hard. They finally got the argument through by pointing out statistics that Natalie has pointed out, and I think Somia's aware of too. The cost of having these, in this case, 25 women in isolation, becoming, unhealthy without early diagnosis, being isolated, having accidents and so on, the cost to you as a council is so much higher than the cost of helping them do what they want on their own. And as a case, it's interesting. I mean, Somia, you say you live near there. It's gorgeous. It's so beautiful. It's done by Paula Thomas Edwards. They do a lot of work with older people, and they really think about it. It's light. It's big. You can move around. It does not feel like a place you go to die. It feels like a place you go to live. And that's really, really key. They also, in terms of the way people live together, they have a pact among them. They don't become a care facility for each other. They watch out for each other. But if someone becomes ill, there's a discussion about, do you stay? How do we have you stay? Do you go to family or care, etc.? So I want to say it's brutal, but it's about housing. It is not a care facility. And I think there's going to be a bit more of that happening. Now, the woman in Quebec, I'll stop after this, but she's looking in part because, I don't know, some of you will know this, some of you won't. The Montreal area had some of the highest COVID deaths going because of negligent care homes. It's a massive scandal in the province of Quebec. It's horrifying. My dad lives there and says, please don't put me in one of those places, which about broke my heart. That can't happen either. We are talking about independent older people living in cities on their own. But, as Somia said, smaller places, care homes have got to be improved as well. And that's a national policy, whatever country we're in. Yeah. I'll hand over now.
Thanks so much. Natalie, your little hand went up too, I saw.
Yeah, so I really great points. I did one of these International Federation Aging on cities just a little while ago, and it's a little bit that's happened here. It's amazing how quickly the conversation turns to nice new schemes, which I think are really important, but I don't think people have really gathered we are not going to build our way out of the current situation we have in most cities. And never mind smaller cities where the land value is not very high, or you're not going to be able to sell it for very much money. And then people's own homes aren't worth anything very much. So when they sell their home, they can't afford these nice new things. Certainly local authorities, if you looked at what's going on with the social care reforms, are not going to be able to afford to put people in those things. We have to think about people who are in their existing homes and keeping them also healthier for longer and independent for longer. And I think Lisa suggested that a little bit more, is keeping people, which is often where they want to be, in their own homes, in their own communities, working and staying physically active and healthy. And the big things around healthy air, physical activity. And if they're just to say one more thing, because I brought this up in my topic earlier, you will spend between the age of 50 and 70, 75 now, most people have to work, have to stay and work. If we could just put 1 teensy percent of the innovation that goes into care and home independence innovation that I've heard about globally, I've been in this sector for nearly 12 years, into thinking about workplace, in keeping people in the workplace with musculoskeletal issues or mental health issues or caring responsibilities, then we would solve some of the problems that we talked about. Maybe people could afford these nice new schemes and to move out. So I think that there are other things we need to think about in terms of people living in cities and growing older in cities.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks so much, Natalie. I can see that Somia's put her hand up as well. I'm conscious I've probably got 2 more minutes, so go for it, Somia.
I just want to say, some of these challenges are huge, and I think they can't be solved in a hurry. But I wanted to point out one lovely little example, and I'm an advocate for small things. In Paris, there was an initiative about allowing seniors to rent one home out to a student or a younger person. And it was fantastic. because they sort of helped each other. It helped the issue of social isolation. It helped the older person get a bit of income, and it made the younger student who was renting a home, just that much more responsible, and sort of brought out their helping spirit in taking care of this. So I just think there are a lot of wonderful examples to celebrate that makes our city just better for everyone. And it doesn't all have to be huge funding, huge problem, huge policy issues.
Well, that's good to know, because we can't fix the problems at all because you'll get discombobulated. I've heard a lot of really fascinating stuff today. I do hope that we will, I think it's the final session today, that Tasha Mohammed is going to edit a session specifically about housing and housing stock. So to Natalie's point about, I think you said earlier, Natalie, 90% or something of the housing stock, it needs regeneration. It's, energy inefficient. It may not be safe. It needs to be sort of, we can't build our way out of this problem, and we will return 80%, forgive me, and we will return to that, because I'm very, very, very exercised whenever we talk about built environment, about adaptation more than invention, because they're just simply, we can't knock it all down and start again. So how do we make that work at scale in an affordable and sustainable fashion? So I'm hopeful that Ashley will have a good crack at that later on in the summit. I think the things I will take away, and perhaps when I pass the baton on to James, and my colleague James Hodding here at Tortoise, who's going to do the next session, starts at 2:25, which is specifically what is London for, as a sort of large capital city that does all kinds of things, not just be home to however many million people, is this question of this idea of how well people can live in a city and make it work for everybody. Is it a feasible place to be and be happy, squished up in the tube, breathing the choking air, fighting with the crowds on Oxford Street to get to, or whatever or being unable to, get on a bus to go out and experience and what have you. I think it's the idea of whether we conceive of the centre of cities as a place to socialise, as a place to work, or a place to just live, or none of those things, because there's part of me that wonders whether the centre of London functions very well at any of those things. So I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much to Lisa and to Natalie and Soumya for sort of getting us up and running today. I feel like you three particularly, and me listening and taking notes for Unity, could have gone on for another 3 hours if the green room was anything to go by. And you're right, we should go for lunch and do that anyway. But thank you so much. And to Annie and to Lisa, who joined us from Canada. I hope we'll hear lots more Canadian voices as the course of the day goes on. Now it's time for you to go and put the kettle on, have a sandwich or a piece of toast or a bowl of cereal if you haven't had your breakfast yet, depending on where you are. And we will be back in just 10 minutes. And James will host a session on what is London for. So we'll see you shortly. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.